All right, so today we get to continue our study of the French Revolution. Now, when we talked about last lesson, we focused on the idea that the French people are desiring equality, right? This whole thing is about equality. There were also financial problems. There were also problems with their leader, the king. There were also some problems with, or I guess, influenced by the Enlightenment, these new ideas causing these people to think differently. But at the heart of all of this was the problem of inequality. So we know that in this beginning phase of the revolution, the people were fighting to correct that. And what they were fighting for was a just or a fair constitution. And they get to the point where they have a limited monarchy. So we're going to go back a slide real quick and talk about this real quick. So they eventually get to the point where they have a French constitution that limits the power of the king. So there's the legislative assembly, and they get to make the laws. So we have this separation of powers, just like the Enlightenment thinkers called for. So early in the French Revolution, it looks like things are going well. It looks like they're being successful. France is creating a whole new society that's not built on the three estates being separated, but people being equal. They have a new government that is a republic where the people get to vote for their leaders and have representation, where their rights can be protected. Uh, in their constitution, every man gets a vote. Now, you might be thinking, oh, what about the women? At this time, no women in any country got to vote. So that wasn't unusual to give the men the chance to vote. The idea was the men of the house could vote for the whole family. So the father would be able to vote for their children, the husband could vote for their wife and their kids. Marriage was a big deal at this point in this society. And so the idea that everything could work through that was just normal. Not saying it was right or wrong, that just was normal at this time. But at this point, it looks like everything is going well. Looks like we're moving towards equality. Looks like we're moving towards something that would be a successful revolution. But today we're going to see how things take a pretty ugly turn. So there's still many, many problems going on. Everyone is still being hurt by a rising cost of living. Essentially, things are still getting more expensive. Bread, ridiculously expensive. Food, ridiculously expensive. Throughout all this, there's a radical group called the Jacobins, and the radicals want more violent solutions. They think these small steps and finding equality is not enough. They want violent solutions to get rid of the king, violent solutions to get rid of some of these problems. Now, we mentioned last lesson that, oh, poor Louis XVI, he's just remembered for not being good at his job. So, in the midst of all this, Louis tries to get out of France. He tries to take his family and get the heck out of there. Um, his wife's family is from Austria. And basically, what Austria has done is they promise France an army if the king can get out to lead it. So, what Louis is trying to do is he's trying to leave his country, get to Austria. They're going to give him an army, and then he's going to be able to march back into France and conquer it. Well, the people capture Louis on the way out as he's trying to escape. The people recognize him because he's the king and his face is everywhere, it's on every coin. So he's essentially put under house arrest, and he doesn't really get to leave his house at all until he is killed. Now, the Legislative Assembly, they're thinking, oh man, Austria tried to go to war with us. And so they declare war on Austria, and they lose that war. Now, one of the things we've said, even just a few weeks we've been studying, wars are expensive. So, in the midst of everyone being hurt by a rising cost of living, in the midst of people's food being too expensive, they're now trying to fight a war, which is also very expensive. So, even though it looks like we're moving in the right direction, things are not going so well over France overall. So eventually, the Legislative Assembly is taken over by the National Convention. And this moves us to the radical phase of the French Revolution. So, if the last part was about building up to people's rights and building up to equality, this part of it is kind of about tearing it all down. So, the Jacobins, they organize an attack on the palace in Paris and they capture King Louis. They capture his family. They put him under arrest. They put him on trial. And eventually, they're going to execute him. The new model, or the new motto of this revolution, is liberty, equality, and fraternity, or brotherhood. And you'll still see this a lot. It's very famous motto that you'll see all over the place if you're talking about this revolution, or sometimes it's copied for other organizations. Now, the National Convention is a part of the more radical group. So the people that wanted violent solutions, they're now taking control of the government. All right. So it's no longer the king in charge. It's no longer the National Assembly. Now we have the National Convention that is in charge. And I'm going to give you a flow chart at the end of all of this that will help make sense of who's in charge when. All right. So one of the first moves of the National Convention and these radical Jacobin group is that they put the king on trial for crimes of treason, because after all, he did try to leave the country to raise an army to come back and attack them, and he's beheaded in 1793. Huge crowd of people celebrating his death. There you see a painting as the executioner's holding his head up for the crowd to see. Now, to us, we're like, oh man, all right, so the leader got killed. All right, Coach Beard, what's next? No, no, no. This was huge. The other leaders in the world looked at this with horror. They were peeing their pants. They were so scared. They couldn't believe that a group of people would rise up against their own king and execute him. Think about it like this. We were talking just a few weeks ago about the idea of the divine right of kings, how kings could do whatever they wanted because the belief was they were placed there by God. So to go against your king was to go against God. We go from those ideas to now all of a sudden you have the king being beheaded by his own people. The rest of Europe, the kings and queens, they just couldn't stand for this. This was terrible. A few years later, his wife, Marie Antoinette, is also executed. Their children are sent around for essentially re education, and most of them live very, very terrible, terrible lives. This painting kind of gives us an idea of how the people viewed the queen, though. She was kind of put on trial for bogus crimes. So here you see she's all lit up by a light. She's dressed all in white. She looks very peaceful, looking up into the heavens, almost up into the sky. And she's kind of the centerpiece, whereas everything else is very dark. So this artist is trying to give us this idea of her innocence, of her grace. She was fairly well respected later in her life, even though early on she was not so much. Now that the king is dead and the National Convention is in charge, we reach this point known as the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror. Now, Robespierre is going to be the leader during this time. He is going to be the leader of essentially the National Convention. Robespierre is going to, through his government, execute thousands of French people for being enemies, quote unquote, enemies of the revolution. So they're going to execute anyone who's suspected of disagreeing with the ideas of the revolution. That's where this beautiful machine comes into place. This is known as the guillotine. Uh, Essentially, the French people were looking for a more a more equal way of killing people. And so they figured, well, what's better than putting a person's head underneath this knife and using it to cut off everybody's head? They all die the same way, whether it's King Louis or whether it's someone in the third estate. These executions are public. They're in the middle of the square. Everybody sees it. When you're going to buy bread in the morning, you have to pass this machine and you're reminded what will happen to you if you don't fall in line and listen to what the National Convention is saying. So essentially, we call this the reign of terror because the government is using terror to maintain control of the country, to get people to do what they want. This is going to last for a period of about a year. But eventually Robespierre himself has his head cut off. I told you this is very a complex situation, very bloody situation. So essentially, people were tired of this. It was too fearful because it'd be a simple thing. Whereas your brother, your sister, your cousin, your friend would disappear. You're like, where'd Johnny go? Well, someone claimed he was an enemy of the revolution. He was arrested and killed, never put on trial. No one really heard from him again. So there's no system of rights. There's really no system of innocent until proven guilty. Very few trials. They're pretty much mock trials. They're just pretend. They're just there for show. Well, eventually Robespierre himself is arrested. He's being accused of tyranny against the people, and he is executed along with the guillotine, along with everybody else. Now, again, other European kings and queens are freaking out. They are terrified that these ideas are going to spread to their country because they see the king executed. They see the queen executed. They see the next leader, Robespierre, executed. And they're all peeing their pants thinking, what happens if my people embrace these ideas? Am I going to be executed as well? And so many countries declare war on France because they don't like these ideas. It's challenging the old system where the kings have all the power. So, in response to this, France issues a draft where men are forced to serve in the army, which again was very normal at the time, and they go to war with many, many countries. And this is going to be very significant because France gets very good at fighting. And then at the end of the French Revolution, they're able to build their own empire and go conquer most of the people around them. During this time, however, we see thousands killed during the Reign of Terror, thousands killed during this radical phase. Here you see a chart that breaks down who is killed. Now, what's surprising is a majority of the people killed would have been in the third estate. You see there with that red or that maroon color and the blue color. Those represent the nobles and the clergy who would have been a part of the first and the second estate. That makes up a very small piece of the pie. The rest of the people executed were members of the third estate, were the members who originally started this wanting equality, wanting better lives. And you have Robespierre getting so sidetracked, so worried about power and his own ideas, where things do not go so well for the French people at all. So, this movement that looked like it had so much promise, this movement that started with the idea of equality, where we move from this terrible old system where you're split up into estates. The king has all the power. They move to a republic phase where the people get to vote. There is equality under the law. Everyone is treated equal to this point where the king is executed. The radicals take charge in the National Convention, and there is fear around France as no one knows who's the next victim is going to be. The people are still poor. The people are still hurting. The country is at war, and they're all looking for an answer. They're all looking for someone to save them from this terrible situation. We're not going to get to that solution until next week, but that's going to lead us to the next leader of the revolution who kind of takes it and takes it on to a new path.